What happens when revolution, in all its fury and righteousness, directs its wrath not just at kings and tyrants, but at the women standing in its way? During the violent upheaval of the French Revolution, the streets of Paris transformed into more than just a battlefield for justice. They became a theater of public humiliation, fear, and vengeance. The ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity were quickly overshadowed by retribution, and women, particularly those aligned with or suspected of sympathizing with the Ancien regime, found themselves subjected to acts of cruelty that extended far beyond the political. Noble or common, innocent or accused, thousands were humiliated, imprisoned, and executed in the name of revolutionary justice. In today's video, we uncover the dark, often hidden history of how women were punished, silenced, and sacrificed during one of history's bloodiest uprisings. The revolution, which began with cries for bread and justice, too often devolved into ritualized spectacles of punishment. In October 1789, thousands of women, furious over the scarcity of food and enraged by economic disparity, marched from Paris to the Palace of Versailles. Their protest, known as the Women's March on Versailles, marked a defining moment in the revolution. Initially hailed as heroines of the people, these women forced the royal family to relocate to Paris, a symbolic victory that marked the rise of the people's power. Yet the revolution, like so many others in history, turned on its own. Not long after these triumphant scenes, the same fervor began targeting other women, especially aristocrats and those perceived as counter-revolutionaries. Noble women and female courtiers were no longer seen as human beings but as symbols of a corrupt past. They were dragged from their homes, publicly ridiculed, spat upon, and dehumanized before being sent to trial, or worse. Public humiliation as a tool of the revolution. Public degradation became a form of punishment in itself. As women were arrested and taken to execution, they were paraded through the streets of Paris in open tumbrils. Crude carts designed not only for transport but for maximum exposure. Among the most prominent victims was Madame Roland, an influential thinker of the Girondin faction. Her final journey to the guillotine was made under the watchful eyes of hostile sans-culottes, who hurled insults and obscenities, stripping her of any remaining dignity. This was not justice, it was ritual humiliation. The parade through jeering crowds served as a warning. Defy the revolution, and you would be reduced to nothing. The final moments of these women were designed to erase not only their lives, but their identities, their legacies, and their voices. Punishments often went beyond execution. Women accused of counter-revolutionary sentiments were subjected to symbolic violence meant to shame. Their heads were shaved, their luxurious garments replaced with coarse shifts, and they were marched through the streets to emphasize their fall from privilege. These acts were deliberate. They weren't merely punitive, they were performative, crafted to strip these women of power, pride, and personhood. Revolutionary prisons, chambers of suffering. If the streets were arenas of shame, the prisons were dungeons of despair. Thousands of women, both noble and common, found themselves locked behind the cold stone walls of France's growing prison system. The most infamous of these was the Conciergerie, once a royal palace, now dubbed the antechamber to the guillotine. Here, women were crammed into filthy, overcrowded cells. The air was heavy with the scent of sweat, straw, and fear. The floors were often wet, the light dim, and the cries of the condemned echoed through narrow corridors. Conditions were nightmarish. Straw mats served as bedding. Disease spread like wildfire in the damp, unventilated chambers. Sanitation was nearly non-existent, but even worse than the physical squalor was the psychological torment. Prisoners never knew when their names would be called in the morning, whether that day would be their last. Other notorious prisons like La Force and Sainte-Pélagie held similar scenes of suffering. After the 1793 enactment of the Law of Suspects, the net widened. Women were no longer safe simply because they avoided politics. Now, failing to show sufficient revolutionary enthusiasm, or merely knowing an émigré could land someone in prison. As cells meant for 6 began to hold 18 or more, even the most basic human dignity was stripped away. We gain insight into these dire conditions through the memoirs of Grace Dalrymple Elliott, a Scottish noblewoman imprisoned during the Reign of Terror. She recounted the horrors of life inside, the sickness, the fear, the constant anticipation of death. The nightly roll calls were particularly harrowing. Each name called might be followed by silence, or the dreaded announcement, "To the guillotine." Unlike male prisoners who often had political camaraderie or fellow revolutionaries in their cells, many women were isolated. Cut off from family, friends, and supporters, their loneliness added another layer to their suffering. The absence of human connection compounded the emotional toll of their imprisonment, leaving them to endure fear and uncertainty in complete solitude. With no one to share their burden, each day was an agonizing reminder of their precarious fate. This isolation wasn't just physical, it was a psychological torture that made their suffering even more unbearable. Psychological torture and coerced confessions. France had officially abolished physical torture by 1788, but that didn't mean revolutionary interrogators were gentle. In fact, their methods were often just as cruel, only more insidious. Psychological torment took the place of the rack and iron maiden. Women accused of crimes against the revolution were hauled before the Revolutionary Tribunal, a court created to deliver swift justice. But in truth, many trials were little more than political theater. Interrogators used coercive questioning, trapping their victims in webs of contradiction. Accusations were often already printed in popular newspapers and pamphlets before trials even began, creating a presumption of guilt. Women were frequently promised leniency in exchange for cooperation, only to be told moments later that refusal meant certain death. These interrogations occurred in cramped, dim chambers filled with angry prosecutors and skeptical judges. The pressure to confess wasn't about truth, it was about submission. Public opinion was weaponized as part of the process. Revolutionary publications like L'Ami du Peuple and propagandistic posters smeared women as traitors before they even reached the courtroom. They were branded guilty by the mob and entered the tribunal already condemned. Confessions extracted in such conditions were rarely honest. Most were the product of exhaustion, terror, and the suffocating weight of public hatred. The September Massacres, when justice collapsed. In early September 1792, the revolution took an even darker turn. Between the 2nd and the 6th of that month, mass hysteria gripped Paris. Rumors of foreign invasion and counter-revolutionary plots sparked a wave of brutal violence. Prisons became execution chambers. These days are now known as the September Massacres. Over 1,000 prisoners were killed in what can only be described as organized mob violence. Among the dead were many women, aristocrats, nuns, and even elderly widows, all executed without trial, without evidence, and without mercy. At La Force and Salpêtrière prisons, women were dragged out of their cells, condemned in makeshift tribunals, and slaughtered in alleyways with swords, clubs, and farming tools. There was no due process, only rage. One of the most haunting aspects of these murders is that the victims remain largely anonymous. Their names were lost in the blood-soaked chaos, their stories buried beneath the roar of the crowd. While the Carmelite nuns of Compiègne, executed in July 1794, are remembered for their calm faith and final hymns, the women of the September Massacres have no such memorial. They were simply erased. Prominent revolutionaries like Georges Danton later justified the killings by claiming, "Let us be terrible so the people will not have to be." But the terror, once unleashed, did not stop. Marie Antoinette, the guillotine's most famous victim. No woman better symbolizes the revolution's appetite for humiliation than Marie Antoinette. Once the Queen of France, she became Widow Capet in the eyes of the revolution, stripped of title, identity, and dignity. After her husband, King Louis XVI, was executed in January 1793, Marie Antoinette was held in the conciergerie under harsh conditions. Her cell was cold and damp. Guards watched her constantly, even as she slept. She was no longer royalty, but a prisoner marked for death. Her trial was quick and brutal. The charges ranged from treason to more grotesque fabrications, including incest with her own son. These accusations were not designed for justice, but for public fury. She denied them, but it didn't matter. On October 16, 1793, Marie Antoinette was led to her execution in an open cart. Her once majestic hair had been cut short, her face was pale, her posture rigid. As she passed through Paris, crowds jeered and spat, eager to see the mighty brought low. She died not just as a monarch, but as a spectacle, an icon of a broken regime offered up to a vengeful nation. Conclusion: the hidden costs of revolutionary justice. The fate of women during the French Revolution reveals a haunting truth. When revolutions radicalize, justice is often the first casualty, and women are too frequently among the first to suffer. From prison cells to crowded squares, women became both scapegoats and sacrifices. Their trials were public performances. Their punishments were as much about humiliation as they were about law. These were not isolated cases. They were part of a pattern, a dark undercurrent in a movement that promised liberty. For every ideal shouted from the pulpit of revolution, there were women silenced in its name. That even the most righteous causes can be corrupted by fear. That when power changes hands violently, it often does so on the backs of the voiceless. And that sometimes the revolution devours not just tyrants, but the innocent as well. As historian Pierre Vergniaud warned shortly before his own execution, the revolution, like Saturn, devours its own children. The French Revolution may have reshaped a nation, but it also left behind a trail of forgotten victims, many of them women whose only crime was being on the wrong side of change. Their suffering was real, their stories heartbreaking, and their voices too often erased. If you found this deep dive eye-opening, please like the video, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful untold histories. Thanks for watching, and remember, history isn't just about the battles fought, but the lives forever changed.